Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. The history of the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Tuesday, January 5th, 2016. Getting into the week here, getting into the brand new year. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645. 877-300-7645. Tom is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials and keeping us out of trouble and ready to answer the phone when you call on in. All right, let's see here. Now, up in Oregon, the situation is still very tense, even though the Hammond brothers have surrendered and are in jail right now on this totally bogus, completely inappropriate terror charge. The standoff at the wildlife facility is continuing. And, of course, the corporate media and certainly the liberals are all out there saying these are terrorists. You know, I mean, the Black Lives Matter people can burn down an entire neighborhood. They're not terrorists. But these people fighting for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they're terrorists. And there seems to be this consistent thread that anybody that challenges the government is wrong. Well, if you look carefully, if you actually study how this country was set up, questioning the government is our duty. We're supposed to do that. The government is supposed to be working for us, for all that money they take from us. And when they do bad things with that money, or our property, like the public lands, we have every right and a duty to call them on that. Now, more and more people are picking up on the fact that the Hammonds were unfairly targeted because the Bureau of Land Management coveted their land. This is a pattern that has been repeated time and time and time again. And it's just greed. It's greed and a federal bureaucracy run amok. People are already drawing parallels with the Sagebrush Rebellion, saying what is really at stake here. And what is really at stake is whether we, the people, own this country or the government just takes it from us and uses it however they want. Sell it off, pledge it as collateral. And again, going back to the Constitution and the Enclave Clause, the Founding Fathers put strict limits on how much land the central federal government could own in order to prevent them from looting the property of the people to get out of their self-created financial messes. And that's where we are right now. Other people are starting to draw a parallel between a potential armed confrontation with the protesters and the FBI with the Boston Massacre, which was a key event on the way to the American Revolution. Now, online polls are showing overwhelming support for the protesters, because they know what's at issue is drawing a line in the sand against a government that doesn't feel it has to play by the rules anymore. Now, on the other side, we are hearing that the FBI is preparing for a Waco-style armed raid up in Oregon. Apparently, they've commandeered some of the local schools in the area as staging areas for weapons. They're bringing in the guns. They're piling up the guns and getting ready for a massive assault. There have been reports that armed drones have been seen overhead at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. But it would be extraordinarily foolish for the government to go on in there with another Waco when you consider how bad the original Waco went for the government in terms of its image, its reputation. So we're seeing a little bit of a contest, if you will, between wanting this to end in a reasonable way and salvage everybody's reputation versus a government attitude that once we decide we're going to go kill people, we're going to go kill them, and that's all there is to it. Citizens living in the area around the wildlife refuge are saying they're being called at home on their personal phones by the FBI, you know, and being questioned about, do you know these people? Do you hang out with them? We're also getting a report, this one came out of Investment Watch blog, where once again the FBI is trying to keep the independent media away from the scene. They only want the corporate media there that will spin this the way the government wants it spun. That may prove to be a little bit difficult because apparently Alex Jones is on his way up there. And there's one thing we can say about Alex Jones. He will stir the pot. And that's a good thing. We're already seeing other reports about how the corporate media's attempts to spin these protesters as terrorists and dismiss them, marginalize them, and basically not let people understand what the issues are. It's not going very well. And this is where the corporate media and the government are inheriting this crisis of confidence they themselves have created over the last couple of decades. Because they don't want you looking at what the real issue is behind this. Oh, it's just people refusing to do as they're told. Well, we have a right to do that. The entire governmental system of the United States is that we don't have to do anything the government says that we feel is wrong. It's in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Soldiers can refuse illegal, immoral orders. The whole point of the jury system is to put the people as the highest authority in that courtroom to guard against the misuse of laws, ambitious prosecutors, and corrupt judges, which is clearly a situation we have here right now. The Hammonds already served the jail time and paid the fines for the accidental fire that scorched some of the BLM land. This terror charge was added on there to put them away for 5 years so the ranch will go out of business and the Bureau of Land Management can buy it. And the prosecutors will not explain how they got from accidental brush fire gets out of control to active terror. See how loosey-goosey they're playing with that word terror? Everything's an act of terror now. Overdue library books, that's an act of terror. Over at New York Magazine, Jonathan Chait is saying that he basically thinks these protesters ought to just be shot dead. How dare you defy the government? Well, defying the government is our natural right. That's why we have the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. Governments tend to be very evil creations because they attract the kind of people that really we shouldn't allow in government to begin with. But we're seeing this very clear agenda coming out from the corporate media and the liberal establishment that just standing up and saying no to the government is a capital crime deserving of a death sentence right then and there. Now, apparently some of these protesters have been receiving death threats. Talks about bullets in heads. This situation is primed to go violent. But remember, the organizers of the protest are not calling for violence. They've been saying, stand down. This is the wrong thing to do at the wrong time. All of the calls for violence are coming from the side of the government and the corporate media and the liberal establishment. And that's a fact. Now, we linked to a map. It's headlined as Public and Private Lands in Oregon. You ought to take a look at it. You will be shocked at how much of Oregon is already owned by the United States government in direct violation of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution that says the federal government can only own land underneath federal government buildings and federally built infrastructure like military bases, harbors, airports, that kind of thing. They can't just grab huge blocks of land. That's not an enumerated purpose for the federal government in the Constitution. And the 10th Amendment says they can't just decide for themselves, oh, well, we're going to grab land for whatever. And we know the real reason they're grabbing the land. Collateral for more borrowing. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And I just got a clarification. Apparently, Alex Jones himself is not on his way to Oregon. He apparently flew back to Austin after he interviewed Louis Farrakhan in Arizona. But they do have Joe Biggs up there. And we need to have our eyes up there for the independent media. Because we know the corporate media has already been given their marching orders. These are bad people. How dare they question the government. Montel Williams, who used to be a talk show host, and now he makes his living hawking for this online loan sharking operation. He's out there saying they should shoot to kill. We need to just murder these people and shut them up. Now, under the USA Patriot Act, that right there is an act of terror. Threat of violence to coerce a change to one's political views is defined as an act of terror under the USA Patriot Act. So, anyway, now let's grab some phone calls because the lines are loading up here. Sean in North Carolina, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike.
Hi.
Wanted to make a quick statement, and I have a question for you. My statement is I think it's very important that the American people get drilled with this gun legislation going on from the point of, because I'm sick and tired of hearing people say, well, his whole point right now is to stop terrorists from getting guns. And the deception in that, in my opinion, lies in our definition of terror. When the United States used to be known as the good guys, then a group like ISIS would be defined as terror. But where the United States stands now, when they use the word terrorist being the bad guys, they're talking about us.
Yes.
And
they're selective about that. Like I said, when Black Lives Matter was burning up, parts of Maryland, the media never referred to them as terrorists. They were protesters and activists. And we have these people up in Oregon who have not committed any acts of violence whatsoever. And already the media is describing us as white terrorists and separate and just whatever they can think of to demonize them. And they're doing that because the last thing they want is the American people saying, okay, what's really going on here? What is their issue? And that's always something the government tries to do, is prevent you from finding out what the grievances actually are. That's why back in the 1960s, the FBI, as part of COINTELPRO, was trying to fan up race hatred between whites and blacks so the white people would stop listening to legitimate complaints coming from the black community about how they were being treated. And they want to do that again. They don't want Americans looking and web searching for all of the abuses carried out by the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Forestry Service that have just been out there at the forefront of this government's grabbing of all of our land so they can pledge it as collateral on more borrowing.
Right. Yeah, I just think, if we can get the American people to understand when he's talking about keeping it out of terrorist camps, he don't want guns in our hands because we're the terrorists today.
Well, absolutely. And I think the good news is, people are very upset with what Obama did today, but taking the long view, it really didn't amount to a whole heck of a lot of anything that is going to affect the vast majority of gun owners. Well, we're going to go into that in a little more detail later in the show, okay?
Okay, but now listen, I have one quick question for you, and that goes along with executive orders. And the question is, if I'm a gun shop owner, and he passes executive orders, is it up to me to obey them because it's not a law? Is it just, do we take it like a suggestion, or is there a consequence or even a way to enforce these executive orders?
Well, the question of enforcement, of course, is going to be up to the executive branch. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, executive orders are legally binding only on the executive branch of the federal government. They have no legal force on ordinary people or state governments or county governments. The second thing that everybody needs to remember, we've been talking about the Constitution, limits on the federal government. The Constitution does not actually bestow law enforcement authority on that central federal government. And that's something a lot of people are really surprised to find out. Under the Constitution, the federal government has no law enforcement authority. They're not allowed to run around with guns and arrest people. That's supposed to be referred to the state and local authorities. Okay?
Okay. All right. Thanks, Mike.
All right. And we're going to switch over here to George in Texas. Aloha, George. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, Happy New Year, Mike.
Happy New Year.
You know the thing about jury nullification? About 25 years ago, it was about 1992, 1993, I was selected on a jury in a local high-profile case of a Christian couple accused of child abuse because some mental case daycare worker who was molested asked the crowd, has your parents ever touched your private parts? And this is like a 2.5-year-old girl. Well, yes. when you give them a bath, you know what I mean? And,
yeah.
The thing is, parents, this couple was demonized, they're arrested, and, throughout the whole, before the trial, the prosecutor was demonizing them on local television, all had her bed, and, the defense was gagged from trying to speak up for the defense. And, when I was selected for the jury, I just came to my mind that, whatever the press said, I'm going to throw it out. But, through the whole trial, the judge would not allow the defense to bring any expert witnesses or anything in their defense, but they allowed the state to bring in all their experts and everything. And, the jury, we in the jury, were just so enraged at the subconscious cues and the body language between the prosecutor and the judge and how the judge treated the defense. And when we finally did the deliberations, it only took like about a half hour, and we just said not guilty because the judge would not allow us to see the defense's evidence. And when we had a little press conference, had a little local TV press conference, and we said all of that on the 6 o'clock news, that all that was chopped on the editing floor. But that's an example of jury nullification, and this was against judicial corruption.
Well, it's a good illustration of why we have jury nullification, and it's also why the courts are literally starting to try and find ways they can charge and imprison activists who are informing citizens of their rights as jurors. Because in that courtroom, it is not the judge who's the highest authority, it is that jury. Because that jury, if the jury was just there to do what the judge and prosecutor want, you could just replace them with store mannequins. The jury is there to guarantee that there is no miscarriage of justice under color of law. And they have every right to say not guilty if they think the law is wrong, if they think the law has been misapplied, if they think there were extenuating circumstances, or as in your case, it is obvious the defendant is not getting a fair treatment in that court. The jury has the right to say, it's gone. He's out of here.
Well, it was a railroad job, and the thing is, the judge's instruction was, the evidence that you're supposed to decide the verdict in this case on the evidence admissible. And, that means they were trying to corral us, and we, in our conscience, we couldn't convict them guilty. We couldn't do it, Mike.
Yeah, I understand. I absolutely understand.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to drop your call there. We're coming up on a commercial break here in a few seconds, so these next two callers, I'm going to hold off until after we come back from the commercial break. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're going to grab a couple more phone calls. Glenn in Pennsylvania. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. I'm thinking that the Bureau of Land Misappropriation may have gone a bridge too far on this one. I think it's good that the Hammonds, turned themselves in. That was wise. I don't think they should be subjected to more prison time, but it's nice that they turned themselves in. Now, I heard an interview, a 2-hour interview with Ammon Bundy this morning on a talk radio show on another network by a fellow who's, I think because of his connection to the Mormon Church and the CSPOA, was able to get in touch with Ammon Bundy directly. And he definitely does not come across as a crazy man. He makes his points pretty clear, pretty reasonably. He doesn't sound like he's anxious to engage violently or anything like that. But I have to side with all of the different groups who are saying this was probably a pretty bad idea. In the long term, I could see now what they're doing could be considered vigilantism, not terrorism. But even that falls under the heading. No. What the issue that the Hammonds were charged over was setting a backfire to stop a much larger wildfire that was started by lightning. And so I'm not talking about the Hammonds. I'm talking about the Bundys. Bundys.
Okay. Well,
the Bundys could be considered vigilantism, but those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. The question is things like timing, location, the situation. I think a lot of people still think it's possible to use normal due process with the government to try and stop this stuff. But if they martyr these guys, I think if the government martyrs these guys with more and more people knowing what the words Waco and Ruby Ridge mean, this could really backfire on the on the federal government if they decide to take them out, even though I'm sure the federal government is bitter and vindictive towards the Bundys given what happened, with their situation.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of that going on here, but it is a public relations nightmare. And I would hope that whoever is in charge of the situation up there in Oregon is aware of that Gallup poll that came out yesterday, where for the majority of Americans, it is the U.S. federal government is the biggest problem facing the nation. And, guns got 2%. And that really tells you where we are, how far we have fallen. The U.S. government has destroyed its own credibility with lie after lie after lie, corruption after corruption after corruption. And they're not going to get that trust and reliance back anytime soon. Americans are now predisposed to look at everything the government does in the worst possible light. And if they go ballistic on these protesters in Oregon, yeah, it will be another martyred situation. It could be another Boston massacre. And but the other side of it, of course, is the longer this goes on, the more and more people are going to be studying what happened and saying two things. Yes, the Bureau of Land Management is out there behaving badly and taking people's lands. I mean, we were talking about how back in the 1980s they deliberately flooded a lake to drown a bunch of ranches on the shore to put them out of business and then come in and grab the land. I mean, that's the kind of underhanded stuff they're doing. And the other issue, of course, is the fact that the prosecutors who put the terror charge on the Hammonds have no explanation for it. How do you get from setting a backfire that accidentally got onto BLM land to deliberate act of terror? It's just not there. There's no justification. But it is that terror charge that carries that 5-year sentence. By the way, I put up a petition at the White House petition site for Obama to ignore, calling for a pardon of the Hammonds. And nothing will come of it, but at least they know what we're thinking out there. Okay.
Yeah, and it's the Bureau of Land Misappropriation, by the way.
Well, yes, you're right. The Bureau of Land Misappropriation.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Let's hope it ends well.
All right. Thanks a lot. We're going to let you go. All right. So anybody can go on out there and do a web search about BLM abuses. You will find huge amounts. Louis Gohmert was actually chastising the BLM in a congressional hearing, saying, if your people keep up your arrogant attitude, I'm going to cut your budget. BLM thinks they're even above the United States Congress. The confrontation over the Red River is going to court, or has gone to court, where the BLM came on in, arbitrarily changed a line on the map and said, all this land is now ours. Remember the movie Blazing Saddles, the Harvey Korman character? That's the BLM. Just grabbing land. Another flashback story we did from Natural Sources. Federal land managers' intimidation, bullying, threaten citizens' rights, create a hostile environment. BLM and USFS lack enforcement authority on federally managed lands. This one also goes into this issue that the Constitution has never provided for a general grant of law enforcement authority to the federal government. They are not allowed to carry guns and arrest people. That is reserved to the states and local governments. The Constitution does not give law enforcement authority to the federal government. They just sort of said, we think it'd be cool if BATF had machine guns and BLM had machine guns, and we all want our machine guns. You can't have machine guns. We want them all for ourselves here. Another big fight out in Utah, reported in theblaze.com. And here's another one. Armed BLM Gestapo threatening rural citizens. This was out of the Independent Sentinel. So there's a huge, huge track record of these abuses. It's an out-of-control federal bureaucracy, and its task is to grab as much land as they can because they need more collateral for more government borrowing. And we know the government can't repay that money. And if the BLM is not stopped, one day we're all going to wake up as tenants on land that belongs to the private central bankers and is no longer our country. They call it the public lands, not the government's lands, the public lands. It belongs to all of us collectively, and the government is stealing it from you, bit by bit by bit, along with as much private land as they can finagle. And that's the reason they put the Hammonds in prison for 5 years. The ranch won't last without them for 5 years. It'll go out of business, and the BLM will be there to buy it all up at pennies on the dollar, because that's what they're in business for. Anyway, now, getting on over to Saudi Arabia, people are still analyzing what the Saudis must have been thinking when they executed those 48 people, including a couple of protesters and a non-violent cleric. It was a grand beheading, and parallels are being drawn between the Saudi Arabia government and ISIS because of their love of beheadings. I mean, the Saudis just did a mass beheading that makes everything ISIS did look like minor impoliteness. They're being described as mad head choppers. And people are saying it's going to have repercussions. And more than a few people have pointed out the obvious timing of this mass execution to create turmoil across the Middle East just in time to derail the prospects for peace in Syria and leading to a potential war with Iran, which would end that whole P5+1 peace deal. And that seems to be what Saudi Arabia is doing. All right, we're going to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're talking about the mass beheading carried out by Saudi Arabia. And very clearly, the timing was deliberate. It's an attempt to stir up chaos across the Middle East, to derail all of the efforts at peace in Syria and maintenance of peace with Iran. But, again, wasn't thought all the way through because Saudi Arabia's rial currency took a hit from this. A lot of the other countries Saudi Arabia was friendly with have come out publicly opposed to their behavior, especially the cutting off of relations with Iran, trying to escalate that situation. And even within Saudi Arabia itself, the population is appalled by this. Now, yes, they do beheadings, but 48 in one day, that was a statement. That was a bloodbath. They went full ISIS. Now, former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Robert Jordan, is saying Saudi Arabia did this and is trying to confront Iran to derail the possibility of peace in the region, in Iran and in Syria. So they're not fooling anybody about this. SputnikNews.com basically saying the Saudis' anti-Shiite provocation has clear geopolitical goals. And of course, in the online world, cartoonists are going crazy over Saudi Arabia's bloodbath. At the same time, they have the chairmanship of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Little irony there, little Franz Kafka going on over there. All right, we're going to take a phone call here now. We're going to talk to Anthony in Canada. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. I guess just slightly change from the topic of today. Just one quick thing. I don't really watch much of the Young Turks, but I was actually watching a video of Cenk Uygur. He was talking about the whole Russia situation, and he was completely talking the whole Russian propaganda line. Like, I was not necessarily a huge fan of them, but on the foreign policy issues, they were generally pretty good in the past. But I noticed now that even the Young Turks, I guess it's almost like Alex Jones. I guess once you hit to a certain level, there's a bit of propaganda that comes out. It seems like they've just become a propaganda machine for the Democratic Party at this point. I don't agree with that.
Well, I haven't watched them all that much, and I think the first few times I watched them, it did appear that they were pushing agendas rather than reporting on the facts. So I don't spend a lot of time, I don't pay much attention to them. Yeah,
no, it was just another issue too. In regards to, I know you mentioned Julian Assange about how he was yesterday, how he was basically saying stuff that the alternative media was always talking about. I guess the only difference with Julian Assange was the fact that he actually had government documents saying that. Obviously, the alternative media, such as yourself, has always known these things. But I guess the difference with Assange was he actually had government documents.
No. You misunderstood. My issue with Assange was that he got front page coverage on Time and Newsweek before he'd ever actually leaked anything, government documents or no. He basically registered WikiLeaks, announced to the world, and he was immediately a media darling. And that, to me, is grounds to think that he is, in fact, a controlled resource, controlled asset. Because he was a big hero to the corporate media, and he hadn't actually done anything yet.
Fair enough. And the other thing, too, he doesn't really talk about, not too many leaks about Israel either will make you wonder.
You noticed that.
Yeah, that's the other thing as well. And one other thing in regards to Trump and I wasn't necessarily in total agreement with Trump's Muslim comments, but this is what the irony is, though. People on the left and on the Democratic side, support Hillary Clinton, who supported, the Iraq war. She supported the disaster in Libya, disaster in Syria, completely supported by the neocons. And that's okay for the left. They don't mention that, even though those policies have killed hundreds of thousands of Muslims. And Trump talks about increased scrutiny about Muslims coming into the U.S., and for the left, it's a complete hell of fire. You know what I mean? It's actually mind-boggling. I don't know if you agree with that as well.
Well, actually, Trump has modified his statement to say we need increased security on everybody coming in to this country, and he's absolutely right on that. And now, I like Trump because he's going to stir things up. He is an outsider, and he's not politics and business as usual. But I do think he's very dangerously politically naive. He relies on TV way too much for his view of what's going on in the world, and Trump needs to hire himself a real good political advisor that knows what's been going on inside the government, behind the curtains and behind the doors. Or sooner or later, he's going to get lured into a real big bear trap.
I agree. And just one last point. I know obviously his son is in the race, but I was watching a video of Ron Paul, and, besides the fact that his son is in the race, it seems that Ron Paul really doesn't like Trump at all. He doesn't see any positive in him at all. I don't know if you've seen any in the comments of what you think about Ron Paul's assessment of Trump.
I haven't been staying up on that. I know I get the regular mailings from Ron Paul, but at this point, I think Ron Paul is supporting his son. And so the biggest obstacle Rand Paul has to overcome is Donald Trump, and so I think that's probably a big reason why Ron Paul is on the warpath. It's just like over on the Democratic side. Bernie Sanders is spending hardly any time campaigning against Hillary. In fact, he's defended her in these debates on issues like the email server, but he's constantly on the attack against Trump. And clearly Bernie Sanders is angling to be Hillary's vice presidential running mate. And so both of them are already campaigning against Donald Trump because he is the one they're going to have to beat. Hillary can walk all over Rand Paul, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Carly Fiorina. Trump is the problem.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. And I think if Bernie Sanders was running a smart campaign with all the dirt with Hillary Clinton, he could have easily brought her down. But I think you're absolutely right. They're in cahoots, and that's why, Hillary Clinton is still running fast in this race. So I absolutely agree with you. So that's it. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks an awful lot there. We'll let you go. The one that really boggles my mind. Now, we all know that the claim that Barack Obama was not a natural-born citizen was bogus, and Washington Post confirmed that hoax was started by Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign. And we worked through and we documented what happened. Yes, he was born right here in Hawaii, of parents who were both American citizens. Doesn't mean I like what Obama is doing, but that is a dead issue. He's a love child from the 60s. These things happened. And if you want to learn the details, there's an article permanently linked at the top of WhatReallyHappened.com called Obama the Love Child, and all the details are in there. But with Ted Cruz, it's a very different situation. He was born in Canada, of parents who were Canadian citizens at the time. His sole claim to being any kind of a citizen of the United States, besides having been naturalized, with the green card and everything, is his claim that his mother was born in Delaware. But nobody can find any supporting documentation. State of Delaware is saying they have absolutely no record. She doesn't have a birth certificate she can show. I think that's a real issue. He doesn't meet the definition of natural-born citizen. He shouldn't even be in the campaign. And what is very alarming is that Ted Cruz, his supporters, and apparently the GOP leadership couldn't care less what the Constitution says. They're ready for a government without the bounds and restrictions of the Constitution. And that is a dangerous sign indeed. And we're seeing it from both parties, no question. All right, getting on to more of the news. We're seeing this report. This came out of antiwar.com. ISIS attacks oil port in Libya's Sidra. And they're talking about how these 12 people were killed and a 420,000 barrel oil tank was set on fire. And it's ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. I'm not entirely sure. I think it may just be the Libyan people trying to kick out their U.S. puppet ruler, which they've been doing for the last 2 years. But the U.S. government doesn't want you to understand the real issues of why the Libyan people do not want to live under U.S. puppet rule. So all opposition is now just being labeled ISIS. It's a label to throw around like terrorist or mentally ill. It's just, throw it on out there. If they're opposed to us, they must be ISIS. I'm not sure. But it's very obvious that the situation in Libya isn't working out too well. The U.S. is going back in there yet again. And Britain and Italy are going to occupy Libya again. Those pesky conquered provinces. All right, we got to take a break for top of the hour news and commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7. We're not about 7645. Sorry about that. That was a goof on my end. All right, so getting over to Iraq, ever since the U.S. government got out of the way and let the Iraq government troops do what they want to do, Islamic State is losing territory. They've lost 40%, almost half of the territory they were once in control of. Interestingly enough, the U.S. is trying to take credit for ISIS defeat in Iraq. But Iraq's government has been saying they're getting in the way. It's almost like they're trying to protect ISIS, which we know they're trying to do. Did you see that ridiculous statement from the State Department just before New Year's, how they declared it their greatest accomplishment of 2015, they brought peace to Syria by bombing Syria to pieces? I mean, we all know government lies, but boy, that's 10 Pinocchios on that one. Absolutely. Now, up in Ukraine, there's been an interesting little story. As you know, we're going into this horrible winter, and infrastructure inside Ukraine is falling apart. They're bankrupt up there. And there is a southern Ukrainian town that was dealing with the cold, regular blackouts caused by the Kiev administration, and they asked Russia for help. And Russia said, yeah. And Crimea has opened up the valves on a gas pipeline going across the border into this town so they can keep warm during this winter. Now, we're seeing a report, this is coming out of Investment Watch blog. Russia has a new submarine out, and it's being nicknamed the Black Hole. Now, to a submariner, that's a specific meaning, because submarines do what they do, working in the world of sound. You really can't see underwater, so everything's done with sonar, usually passive sonar, hydrophones, because if you're out there actively pinging, you're broadcasting your location. And 20, 30 years ago, Russian and Chinese submarines were almost considered a joke compared to their American counterparts because they were so noisy. In fact, the Navy here on Oahu used to say you could drop a hydrophone into Honolulu Harbor and hear the Chinese Sea ballistic missile submarines idling at the docks in Shanghai. Well, no more. They have been playing catch-up, and Russia's new submarine is as stealthy as anything that the U.S. has. Now, the U.S. has been trying to develop this new high-powered sonar, and it's caused quite a bit of controversy because every time they go out and test with this thing, sea life dies, floats to the top of the water. Whales and dolphins are driven into harbors they normally don't go into, even up onto the beaches. This is a very painful sonar system. And they're trying to basically develop a sonar that can literally punch through the thermocline and get a return. Now, here's a very bizarre story. This is out of Newsweek, no less. And it happened on a flight from Greece, specifically Athens to Tel Aviv. And the passengers were on the plane. They had cleared the security screening. And there were 2 Palestinians on the flight going to Tel Aviv. And the Israelis on the flight kicked up a fuss, refused to get in their seats so the plane couldn't pull back from the gate, kept insisting, you check these Palestinians. The Palestinians have been cleared by security twice. And the Israelis were just standing there saying, we will not share a plane with these Palestinians. And finally, the Palestinians did the right thing. They said, we'll take the next plane, which is what they did. And I don't think the Israelis understand this doesn't look very good in the eyes of the world. Anyway. German journalist and editor Udo Ulfkott, I got it right, has gone public saying that part of his job working in German media was to publish articles actually written by the Central Intelligence Agency and put his name on it to sort of launder the propaganda. He was not happy about it, but he was told point blank that if he didn't do it, he would be fired. And Ulfkott made the revelations during interviews with Russia Today and Russia Insider. Now, here in the United States of America, the propaganda ministry is demanding they need a bigger budget. They've got to counter Russia Today. How dare Russia Today tell the truth to the American people? We have to propagandize the American people. By the way, not too long ago, that was actually illegal. There was a law in the United States saying the U.S. government could propagandize the rest of the world all they wanted, but they were not allowed to propagandize the American people. Congress rescinded that law. And so now you know that the government is in fact propagandizing you. And what's really kind of weird, when you talk to anybody who's involved in this kind of work, the idea of what is true and false or factual isn't even a factor. It's all propaganda, and we have to win the propaganda war. Which is why all of you have to learn how to be your own best analysts. Do your own research and figure out what's going on for yourself. Now, we reported yesterday on how the brand new mayor of the city of Temixco in Mexico was assassinated on her first day in office. Now, she had campaigned on going up against organized crime and the drug cartels, and she was killed. And apparently, it's already kind of all over the place. The contract on her was just $30,000. Down in Mexico, that's what it costs to have a politician erased. Of course, and a lot of things are cheaper down in Mexico. So, all right, let's talk about the economy a little bit. The stock markets kind of ticked along even today. Still trying to recover from yesterday's absolute rout, and they're still trying to blame that all on the Chinese. But we're not out of the woods. We've been talking about all these indicators of an economy that is slowing down. Shipping indicators down, rail indicators down, manufacturing indexes are down. And as of today, the Baltic Dry Index has hit a brand new record low of 468. Now, the Baltic Dry Index is simply a measure of how much raw materials are being bought and transported from where the materials are mined or grown or manufactured to the place where they're turned into products to go into the stores. And it is an early warning indicator, a canary in the coal mine, if you will, of what the economy is going to be doing. Because if nobody is buying at the stores and the shopping malls aren't ordering from manufacturers and the manufacturers don't need raw materials, the first place that slowdown shows up is that Baltic Dry Index. All right. Story coming out of Western Journalism Center. Congress is about to take an axe to Obamacare. in a huge way that he will despise. And the GOP-led Congress is poised to take action to fulfill their 2010 pledge to repeal Obamacare. The damage has already been done. We've already lost our low-cost health insurance. Even if Obamacare is the Affordable Care Act is stricken from the books, those health insurance companies aren't going to lower premiums. They don't have a reason to do that. And we know that any law Congress is going to pass against Obamacare, Obama will veto it, and they probably can't get a veto-proof majority. But I think the verdict of history is there. Obamacare was a complete, unmitigated disaster. It was a crime committed against the American people. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. A little bit of breaking news coming down from Oregon. Twitter has apparently just suspended the Twitter account of Ammon Bundy. Apparently they don't like what he's saying. They don't want what they're saying to get out. That the issue is not just the abusive sentencing of the Hammonds, but the abuses of the Bureau of Land Mismanagement against ranchers all over this country. They're trying to keep that from getting on out because these protesters in Oregon have a legitimate grievance. The protesters in Nevada have a legitimate grievance. The protesters in Utah have a legitimate grievance. The protesters in Texas have a legitimate grievance. So, now then, interesting little story came out of RINF.com, and it's talking about this incident. It happened a while back on December 18th. There was an anti-austerity demonstration up in Montreal, and it was peaceful, nonviolent, and then all of a sudden things started to get rather chaotic and out of control when this group called the Black Bloc showed up. And they wear masks, and they were disruptive. And then one of them took his mask off to wipe his face and was immediately recognized by one of the demonstrators as being a police officer who had arrested her at an earlier protest. So now all the protesters gather around these Black Bloc people demanding to know, are they all police officers? And it ended up with one of the officers pulling his gun and threatening to shoot the protesters. Now the issue here is the violence was being caused by police infiltrators, undercover infiltrators who went on in there to cause violence to justify the police coming on in and clubbing the peaceful demonstrators, driving them away. And again, it's an old tactic. COINTELPRO did it in the U.S. hundreds of times back in the 1960s. The day the hippies took over Disneyland, which discredited the anti-war movement. Oh my goodness, they were attacking Mickey Mouse. That was set up by the FBI. And people now understand that's what's going on, and they're spotting the police infiltrators. And it winds up with the police pulling their weapons and threatening the protesters to get away because they've been outed as an agent provocateur. And sadly, the Montreal police said that this was perfectly justified because the officer feared for his life. Well, you know something? If you're going to be an infiltrator and an undercover provocateur, you have to understand that if you are caught and discovered, people are going to be very unhappy with you. And that's not a license to pull your gun and start shooting people just because you weren't very good at your job. So let's talk about the campaigns and the candidates. Trump right now seems to be almost counting on there being a new recession this year, which does seem likely to happen. And he understands that that will provide even more impetus for Americans to vote out the career establishment politicians and vote in a bunch of new blood. There's going to be a tremendous anti-incumbency, anti-Israel firster fever sweeping the elections. It's going to be such a landslide, even the vote riggers are not going to be able to reverse it. Without advertising to the world, that's exactly what they're doing. Now, apparently, at one of Trump's rallies, and by the way, they're huge. We're starting to get pictures from these things. Trump inevitably rents an entire sports arena for his rallies, and inevitably they are full. Apparently Trump was speaking at one of his rallies, and somebody in the audience said, blank Obama, rhymes with luck. And Trump responded, see, I'm not allowed to say that, but that's beautiful. A lot of people are commenting about Trump's spokeswoman and this necklace she wears that is made out of bullets. How can you wear that? Well, they're shiny and they're cheap. Anyway, and as a matter of fact, we did post a photo from Donald Trump was up in Lowell, Massachusetts. It's just 5 miles south of the New Hampshire border. And got a great picture of this huge, huge crowd. Remember when Hillary went into that bicycle repair place a couple of months ago? Nobody showed up. They tried to get her own campaign staff to cluster around her and use a really narrow view to make it look like she had a crowd around her. Now, Bernie Sanders is out there, and he was doing a speech, and he stated one of his pillars for his campaign. He will break up the big banks his first year in office. Sounds good. We'd all like to see these giant, criminal, corrupt big banks broken up. We know Bernie doesn't mean it. Because Bernie Sanders, like Hillary Clinton, is getting huge amounts of money from Wall Street. They're just saying what they think you want to hear to get your vote. And we had enough of that from Barack Obama in 2008, 2012. He told us what we wanted to hear. I'll end the war. I'll bring our kids home. And of course he didn't. Because they're politicians. Lying is what they do. One of the reasons Donald Trump is so attractive to me, he comes out of the world of business, where you live and die on your reputation for keeping your word. If you wreck your reputation, you are over and done with. You don't go on a vacation, come back to Washington, D.C. 2 weeks later, and everybody's forgotten your lie, because that's what you do as a politician. So that's a plus for Donald Trump. I still think he's very dangerously naive about a lot of what's really going on inside the government. He's as much an outsider as Jimmy Carter was, and I think he's just as naive as Jimmy Carter was. Meanwhile, the House Intelligence Committee has ordered an investigation into the recent scandal where the NSA was spying on Benjamin Netanyahu and inadvertently swept up phone calls of members of Congress. Harumph, 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 how dare we spy on Israel? Forgetting that the House Intelligence Committee actually authorized this in the first place. So the House Intelligence Committee is investigating surveillance of Congress that the House Intelligence Committee initially authorized. So we can expect an honest and objective and fair evaluation of what's been going on here. Okay, we're coming up here on another commercial break. When we come on back, we're going to be talking about immigration and how it's impacting Europe. And we'll be talking about, well, a lot of other things as well. So we'll be back after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome to our show. And we're going to talk a little bit about immigration because this plan by the globalists, the New World Order people, George Soros, to try and blur all of the people of the planet into one formless mass of human beings with no sense of identity to make us obedient, pliant workers is not going very well. In fact, it sparked a huge backlash of nationalism in many of these countries, including right here in the United States of America. Now, Sweden has started checking IDs at their borders. The so-called Friendship Bridge does not exist, and they're going to impose caps on how many refugees they allow in. Because the refugees have not really been behaving. Apparently there was a big stink over in Germany on the New Year's celebration that got completely out of hand. It involved sexual assaults against a lot of German women. Now, here in the United States of America, there's another problem, okay? Illegal aliens coming into this country are somehow able to get fake Puerto Rico birth certificates. Now, Puerto Rico is a possession of the United States, and if you're born in Puerto Rico, you're considered a U.S. citizen. And so these illegal immigrants are getting these fake Puerto Rico birth certificates, which are being accepted, and getting these people U.S. passports, driver's licenses. Meanwhile, of course, TSA is not going to recognize your driver's license as ID to get on an airplane. Do you realize the refugees and the illegals are getting a better deal from the U.S. government than us legal citizens are? It's amazing here. Now then, here's a funny story. As you're probably aware, down along the Mexican border, there's a group that calls themselves the Minutemen. It's a volunteer operation, vigilantes if you want to use that word, and certainly the open borders people don't like them, but they basically patrol the Mexican border trying to stop illegal migrants and drug trafficking, and they made a citizen's arrest of 2 men in an SUV carrying 1,300 pounds of cocaine. And they were going to take them over to the police, obviously, DEA. The 2 men in the SUV pulled out ID cards identifying themselves as working for the Central Intelligence Agency. And they claimed that they were bringing the drugs across the border as part of a CIA operation, and the cocaine belonged to the CIA. Really? What's the CIA doing with it? Well, what have they always been doing with it? I mean, think back to the Iran-Contra scandal when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas. They had that little smuggler pipeline going, centered on Mena, Arkansas at the north end and several other places at the south end, including Panama. That's the reason we went into Panama and got Noriega. He was trying to blackmail Bush over the fact that the biggest drug smuggler in the country is the country. And they're still doing it. 1,300 pounds of cocaine. Now, I don't know what the current street value of cocaine is, but I can imagine that's a lot of money. 1,300 pounds of cocaine. Especially if it hasn't been cut yet. All right, so let's talk about Barack Obama's gun control, or to be more accurate, people control, because nothing scares a dictatorship more than an armed and angry populace. Obama got on TV earlier today. CNN spent the time literally broadcasting canned and packaged U.S. government anti-gun propaganda during Obama's speech. And I think probably the silliest moment of the entire presentation was when Barack Obama started talking about the victims at Sandy Hook and how sad he felt when he thought about them, and he pretended to wipe away a tear. You know, this is a guy who has rained death and destruction down on innocent people all over the globe and could care less about it. But when the cameras are on him and he wants your guns, he's going to cry for the poor victims of Sandy Hook. It was rather shameless. By the way, somebody actually took count. In his speech, Obama referred to himself 76 times in 33 minutes. Remember what I said about narcissistic personality disorder? This is an indication. It's all about how he feels, how he wants to take away the guns. Now, the reality is that his executive orders were not the gun grab nightmare a lot of people thought they would be. Most of them are procedural, and they have the stated purpose of closing some loopholes in the background check system. Now, one of the things they have in there is that doctors are now allowed to break doctor-patient confidentiality to report patients who are mentally ill to the FBI, to be added to the cannot buy a gun list, which sounds good on the face of it. We don't want crazy people running around with firearms. But, you know, mentally ill is a very fuzzy label like potential terrorist, and it can be applied at whim, including to people who simply do not trust or like the government. The Soviet Union used to do that. Oh, you don't trust the government? Oh, you're suffering from paranoid delusions. You're mentally ill. You can't have a gun. Only people who love and believe in the government are allowed to have guns. It's not what the Second Amendment was all about. And we've already seen with the word terrorist, when they used terrorists to get exemptions to due process and civil rights, get you to go along with torture, we use the word terrorist, and now terrorist is mutated. And there are, according to various U.S. government documents, there are 74 categories of behavior which would label you as a potential terrorist, including running a conspiracy website or reading a conspiracy website. Talking about the New World Order in derogatory terms, you're considered a potential terrorist. All the FBI has to do is go to your doctor and say, hey, do you see any sign of mental illness? And if you look at that psychiatric diagnostic manual, it's just page after page of normal human behavior redefined as a mental illness in order to sell medication, and the government can use that same loose definition of mentally ill to start taking guns away from law-abiding, peaceful American citizens. They could save time and just say that anybody who likes guns is mentally ill automatically. So it's a slippery slope. And like everything else the government does, it sounds good on the first read, but when you start thinking about how it could be abused and misused, you understand the trap. Now, there's an article over in PatriotRising.com, and they're already talking about how there is a new psychological term, oppositional defiant disorder. Okay? Which means anybody that doubts or opposes government action is already defined as mentally ill, which would then be used by the FBI to declare you as mentally unfit to purchase a gun. Only people who love the government can have guns. Now, another provision that was in Obama's executive orders is a gun ban on Social Security recipients whom are deemed incapable of handling their own finances. I think any senior citizen who is that mentally deteriorated probably isn't interested in buying a gun anyway, but that's in there. Something else they have in there is a no minimum threshold on private gun sales, requiring background checks. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show. And Obama's performance this morning was underwhelming, bordering on the silly with his tears over Sandy Hook. This from a president who has been killing people all over the world who don't deserve to be killed. Drone strikes, continuation of the torture policies, all of that stuff. And he has the nerve to get up there and pretend that he's actually upset over what happened at Sandy Hook. So they're trying to, it's basically theater. It's tragedy theater to get you to hate guns. And the problem isn't the guns. The problem are the people. Judge Janine came on out and said, if your goal is to protect Americans from acts of terror, shoot the terrorists. We had that incident happen in Las Vegas a couple of weeks back. Girl took a car, deliberately drove up on the sidewalk, killed a bunch of people. Didn't hear anybody demanding we all give up our cars, did we? Only in the area of guns are the actions of a very, very tiny, tiny minority, 0.01%, used as justification to take guns away from the rest of us. Obviously, disarming the public is the goal, not fighting terror or crime. I mean, Obama is giving military weapons to ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq, gave military weapons to Mexican drug criminals through the Fast and Furious program. But by golly, you, the law-abiding American citizen, are not allowed to have guns. If somebody's breaking into your home to kill you or rape you or rob you, you just dial 911 and wait patiently and patiently and patiently in the hope they'll show up, which usually takes anywhere from 15 to 22 minutes, depending upon where you live in the country. And you may be taking your life in your hands or your property because the police are stealing more from the American people under civil forfeiture than the criminals do, and being trained by those Israeli security companies. They've killed more innocent Americans last year than the mass shooters and terrorists put together. So let's grab ourselves a phone call here. John in Illinois, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. How are you? I'm good. I just wanted to know what your viewpoint was on the flat Earth.
On the what?
The flat Earth theory. I think it's going to be a big topic for this year.
No, it's another fake Apollo moon landings and Bigfoot and the rest of it. Okay, thank you very much. Now then, the bottom line here is Obama's plans are not only unconstitutional, his executive orders exceeding his authority, they're not going to work. If you believe the official story of what happened in San Bernardino a while back, the two accused shooters were not mentally ill. They handled their own finances. They had no prior violent crime record. They would have passed the background check. Now, the good news is every time the gun grabbers get on their high dudgeon, the American people respond peacefully in defiance. The percentage of Americans who own guns has increased. The percentage of Americans who believe we have a personal right to own firearms has increased. The average number of guns owned per gun owner has increased. The amount of ammunition possessed per gun owner has increased. Concealed carry laws are spreading from state to state like wildfire. Castle doctrine laws are being passed in more and more states. For those of you who don't understand, castle doctrine is as in your home is in your castle. If somebody's breaking in, you have a right to defend yourself with lethal force. Stand your ground laws are being passed in more states. And it just keeps on going. The American people understand that talk about disarming the American people is all about bringing dictatorship to this land. It's not going to stop the criminals or the terrorists. They can smuggle guns. They can steal guns from other people. They can make guns. When Iran-Contra was going on, part of the operation in Bill Clinton's Arkansas was a gun manufacturing operation that was making untraceable M16s. It's not that difficult. And in all this talk about saving Americans from crime and violence, not a mention about the documented link between prescription psychiatric medication and violence. And, of course, it's time to just stand up and say, a lot of these shootings appear to be false flags to push that political agenda. All right, we're going to start grabbing some phone calls here. Jim in Ohio, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Jim, are you there?
Yes, here, Jim.
Okay,
yes.
You're on the air. What's on your mind?
Mike, everything that's been going on it's all started, if you think back, from 9/11. 9/11 was a catalyst of all the gun laws and trying to take our guns away and the false flags. And I think 9/11 is the linchpin. If 9/11 is exposed, investigated, and the truth comes out, the whole house of cards will come down.
Well, that's already happening. First of all, I think calling for a new government investigation of 9/11 is a complete waste of time and money. It just gives them another opportunity.
Not a government investigation. No way.
Well, we've already investigated out here in the independent media, and the one thing we all agree on is we got lied to about 9/11. And let's agree on that one point and decide what are we going to do about a government that rules us through lies, fraud, and deception. We don't need to go any further. We don't need to argue over trivia and minutia. We all agree that 9/11 was a hoax and a fraud. The next question before the board is, what do we do? What do we, the people, do with a government that uses lies, fraud, and deception to control us?
Well, we're trying to get these 28 pages released, the ones that have been,
Well, that appears to be another propaganda stunt. Now, my understanding is that the 28 pages originally mentioned Israel as being involved on the basis of those arrested dancing Israelis, but there's another set of 28 pages that tries to put the blame for 9/11 on Saudi Arabia. And so I think that's a setup to try and protect Israel one more time. So I'm not all that interested in the 28 pages. Again, we all know we were lied to. That's all we need to know. Now's the time to decide, what are we going to do about the fact that we were lied to by this government? About not just 9/11, but about Saddam's nuclear weapons, about torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin, Spanish mine in Havana Harbor, weapons on the Lusitania. It goes on and on. Okay, we've been lied to enough. We, the people, need to decide if we are going to continue to live under a government that lies to us about everything, and even more so, are we going to condemn our next generation to live under such a government? That's what we need to be deciding.
And let's not forget the mainstream media.
Oh, they've made themselves irrelevant at this point.
They play along with them, and they lie to us all.
Okay, and by the way, I call them the corporate media because they're not the mainstream anymore. They have the majority of Americans are now coming to the online world, to the independent media to find out what's going on. We're the new mainstream.
For sure.
Okay?
Sure. Yep. I enjoy your show, Mike. You're a great show.
All right. Thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go and take Tim in Wyoming. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Michael. Thanks for taking my call. You were mentioning about the San Bernardino situation. Now, the thing I wanted to mention, the thing I wanted to talk to you about San Bernardino, that there have been witnesses. I don't know if those 3 witnesses are still alive or have been put in a prison or maybe found mentally ill through the 74 different ways they could do it. But there were supposedly four tall white men who were supposed to have been part of what happened in San Bernardino.
Yes.
The two individuals that we keep thinking are the ones who did all the shooting. And now this other thing too, whether they did or they didn't is another issue. But there's the number 14. I'm not sure why the number 14 is significant, but it keeps being the number of those who were supposedly killed. I say supposedly because sometimes the number is said to be 14 or said to be less than it is, but being 14. Now, what is the significance of the number 14? I tried to find it in the Quran, and I can't figure out.
That's kind of getting a little bit out there. But we do want to get back to the fact. I do want to get back to the fact. In San Bernardino, there were 3 shooters who were described as tall, white, athletic men in military clothing, plus the 4th one who was the driver. And it just didn't match. Anyway, we got to take a break for news and commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 3. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, and we're going to take a call right now. John in Kansas, thank you for waiting patiently all this time. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, got a question for you.
Yes.
How do you feel about the government's violation of the double jeopardy clause?
How did they do that?
Well, in the sentencing of the Hammond father and son, so they had already served their time.
Well, see, double jeopardy says you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. In this case, what they did is they added additional different charges, so it gets around the double jeopardy rule. The issue, I think, for the Hammonds is simply that there is no justification to bring a charge of terror against them over this mishandling of a backfire. And certainly it's absurd to have convicted them on that charge. And and absolutely for the judge to say they got to go back to jail, to me that qualifies as cruel and unusual punishment. But this is miscarriage of justice. It's an absolute abuse of the judicial system. There is nothing the Hammonds did that qualifies as an act of terror, and yet that's the one that carries the 5-year sentence. Again, the goal is, with these people in prison for the next 5 years, their ranch will collapse and be scooped up for pennies on the dollar by the Bureau of Land Management.
Absolutely. So you're going to allow the government to issue a new law and then retroactively violate the double jeopardy clause?
Well, they haven't violated the double jeopardy clause. What they did is they added a different charge. It's a technicality. And no, I don't agree with what the government did. I'm not allowing it. And clearly the government is morally in the wrong here. And I'm surprised they found a jury that was going to convict these guys.
Absolutely. Have you seen any of the evidence coming forward that it's the Harry Reid backroom deals that's bringing this forward?
Harry Reid certainly got caught in a lot of backroom deals with the BLM down in Nevada. I don't know that he's involved up here in Oregon. there were allegations floating around that one of the reasons they were so desperate for the Hammond Ranch is there is uranium underneath the ground there that has already been promised to a foreign government. And that's why there was the big rush to get the Hammonds off there.
Sure. There's more than uranium, but uranium's one of the big ones.
Yeah, there's also natural gas down there.
Right.
Okay,
Mike.
All right. Thanks an awful lot. Yeah, and here's the key. The prosecutors and the judge will not answer the question, why did you bring a terrorism charge against the Hammonds? They won't explain it. Just, this is what we've done, deal with it. Now, up in Seattle, Washington, Seattle passed a new tax called the gun violence tax, where anybody who's buying and selling guns or ammunition had to pay this tax to deal with violence in the streets, and then, of course, the tax gets passed on to the customers as higher prices for everything. So, Seattle gun store Precise Shooter is changing locations. They're moving 16 miles out of the city, calling this gun violence tax a form of collective punishment. Now, seriously, if Seattle wants a violence tax, shouldn't you tax the people who are violent and leave the rest of us alone? It really doesn't make any sense. They're not doing this for violence. They're doing it, they're trying to discourage people from owning guns. And they're getting exactly the opposite result. Gun sales are through the roof. By the way, Hillary Clinton came out praising Obama for his executive orders and then tried to claim that everything in them were influenced by her own anti-gun proposals. So she's taking credit where it may not be due, but in any event, she's clearly another gun grabber, and that's a reason not to vote for her. Story coming out of governmentslaves.info. Apparently, there was a drug enforcement bust, multi-agency bust, seized 250 pounds of marijuana from 3 men, one of whom is a California sheriff's deputy. And these are the people that Obama wants us to call and protect our homes when the criminals come in and we don't have any guns anymore. I don't think so. Another story out here, this is from Activist Post. Apparently, Chicago Police Commander John Berg, called the worst cop in history, has cost the city of Chicago and Cook County over $100 million in legal fees and settlements for violating the civil rights of the people of Chicago. And he still gets his $4,000 a month pension. Nothing's happened to him. The city has spent all this money dealing with all of his crimes. He's never been arrested. He's never been charged. You want to be a mass shooter? Join the police force. You can do whatever you want. You're not going to get charged. By the way, over in New York City, you're going to love this one. Shades of Hillary Clinton's email server. Former NYPD Commissioner Raymond Kelly's emails were ordered preserved by a court order as evidence in a high-stakes class action lawsuit alleging a summons quota system within the department. And the NYPD has just informed the court that despite the court order, the emails were inadvertently wiped out, deleted. Now, anybody who knows about computers knows you can recover deleted files. These had to be wiped, overwritten. And apparently the NYPD has no backups. And for some reason, the National Security Agency doesn't seem to have copies of these either. So it looks like Raymond Kelly's off the hook. The class action lawsuit has no evidence to proceed. Now, yesterday, actually last week, I was talking about how so far here in Hawaii, we haven't seen the kind of out-of-control police brutality that we see on the mainland from these police departments trained by these Israeli security companies. And it appears, tragically, I spoke too soon because there is a lawsuit involving a Hawaii police officer, and somebody got it on video. And the video went viral. And what it was is there was this Hawaiian man who saw a monk seal lying on the beach that appeared to be sick or injured. Now, Hawaii has very strict laws regarding wildlife. You don't touch them, don't harass them. Huge, huge fines. This man did not harass the seal. He basically knelt down in the sand about 10 feet away, and he conducted a native Hawaiian healing ritual, which basically is praying to the gods and gently pouring sand through your hands. That's it. It's on the video. Very respectful. The seal does not appear upset by his presence. In fact, the seal is watching him, seeing what he's doing. But this Honolulu police officer came on over and said, "You're harassing the sea lion. You got to go." So the man gets up, starts to walk away. Police officer follows him for quite a distance. Hawaiian man picks up a plastic bag with his possessions, and then all of a sudden, with no warning, the Honolulu police officer runs around in front, pepper sprays him, whips out his little spring-loaded baton, and just pounds him to a pulp, breaking several bones. Now, this Hawaiian man has filed a lawsuit. I hope he wins, although Honolulu and Hawaii are in serious financial trouble already, may not get the money. But I'm very surprised here in the Aloha State that this kind of out-of-control police brutality is starting to show up. Because as I mentioned before, I know a lot of local HPD. They're very nice people. I understand that this particular officer, his name is Wang, has been transferred to another department on the island. He should have had his badge and gun removed. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And we're getting some more information about that California sheriff's deputy who got nabbed in a marijuana smuggling ring. Apparently, he had $2 million worth of marijuana in his car. And in a charming touch of irony, it turns out this sheriff's deputy back in California worked on the anti-drug squad and put a lot of people in prison for little baggies or a couple of joints. So I wonder what kind of a sentence he's going to get. But when I was in college, Cal State Fullerton, and when I was back in college, I indulged in the evil weed. The best connection was a California highway patrolman. He was confiscating the stuff from dealers, and he was selling it to the college kids out of the trunk of his black and white. And after about a year, he quit the highway patrol, and he bought himself a Radio Shack franchise. And we were very good friends. And that was back when Radio Shack was a lot of fun to be in because they sold bits and pieces of things you could build with. So, anyway, let's see. There seems to be an issue with our... oh, there it is. Okay. My electronics is getting weird on me. Interestingly enough, a lot of people have been put into prison for drug charges on the basis of these field drug test kits. If they get a positive, it is admissible as evidence, and people have been put in prison just on that one piece of evidence alone. Now, there's been a study by the Marijuana Policy Project where they basically got one of these official police field drug test kits and they ran tests on things like Tylenol, and the field test said Tylenol is cocaine. Then they tried the test on Hershey's chocolate, testing for marijuana. That tested positive. And then the final test was they ran the test on an absolutely empty sample container, and it came up as a positive drug result. It's just absurd. For people to have respect for a justice system, they have to see that it's just. The guilty, the truly guilty, are punished. The innocent are left alone. Anything else, and it's not justice, it's repression. Now, over in Columbus, Ohio, we've had another case of a homeowner who shot a suspect in a failed home invasion. And apparently this teenager tried to break into this house, and there were 2 residents in the house, both of whom had legally owned firearms. And they shot this guy, 18-year-old Amir Jamil Kirby, and died at the scene. And yes, it's a tragedy, but he shouldn't have been there. And it is a reminder that common sense says we have a right to keep and bear arms in our homes for self-defense. Because when the crime happens, when the rape happens, when the robbery happens, when the murder is attempted, there are only 2 parties present: the perpetrator and the victim. And the only way to save the victim is to give the victim the means to defend themselves. And that means weapons equal, if not superior, to those of the hands in the criminals. And we know a lot of criminals in the U.S. are getting assault-style weapons from Mexican drug criminals who are getting them from the U.S. government's Fast and Furious program. So even setting aside the issue of the Second Amendment being about preserving the other 9 in the Bill of Rights, we all have a right to defend our homes and our lives and our loved ones. And the government wants to take away that right, and we know from past history that means crime will increase. Whose side is the government on? The criminals or the people? Now, illustrating that point I was making the other day about how reckless they have become with the idea of somebody being a terrorist, there's a story that came out of thestar.com about a 6-year-old Canadian boy, 6 years old, who's on the no-fly list. And apparently he's stopped at the airport only because he's got the same name as somebody else who was put on the watch list. And that's where the terror watch list really falls apart. Because there are a lot of people on the planet who share the same name. I'm aware of at least 7 other people named Michael Rivero. One of them's a small-time basketball player, middle league, minor league rather, up in New York. There's another Michael Rivero who's a big film star down in the Philippines. The list is sloppy. The list is inaccurate. The list has mostly innocent people on it. And they're going to use that to deny Second Amendment rights to perfectly law-abiding American citizens. That is a violation of the Second Amendment. The anti-terror list is not due process. It's amazing. Now, let's talk about computers and security. Apparently, according to this article coming out of the Register, half of all British financial institutions are vulnerable to well-known cryptographic flaws. Now, maybe these are some of those little backdoors that are put in there by the NSA so they can spy on British banking. A lot of it has to do with bad SSL certificates. But computer security is a bit of a joke because the NSA has punched holes through it in order to spy on people in governments and businesses, and the real criminals will find those holes. It's easier than trying to come up with your own exploit. Just look for what the NSA has already built in there. Now, over at HSBC, they've had their second day with the online banking system not working. Customers are sending in tweets saying, have they tried switching it off and on again? Remember what I said the other day when I was talking about my trials with Windows 10? We have become very dependent on computer technology. And yet we've reached a stage where it is shabbily made, poorly programmed, poorly maintained. We can't sustain this infrastructure we're dependent on now. And the same thing happened to Rome when it began to fall. When the technology they had developed and then become dependent on, they couldn't keep it repaired any longer. We're seeing the same thing today with computers. We'll be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show. And speaking of flaky computers, I think probably none is more flaky than the Obamacare sign-up system. But I think there's a problem over at the White House petitions website because, as I mentioned earlier in the day, I put up a petition for a presidential pardon for the Hammonds so they don't have to spend 5 years in prison on a terror charge arising out of the mishandling of a brush fire. I've had 5 people so far write in to say that they signed the petition, but they don't see the number showing up. And I'm looking at the petition now, and it shows only one signature from me, the person who created it. So something's going on. Maybe they're running the petition website on Windows 10. And I got some nasty email about my comments about Windows 10, but, I did give it a fair try. I did put it on a laptop. And I did work with it, and it's an unmitigated disaster. Now there are allegations coming on out from betanews.com that Microsoft is not only spying on all your traffic, they're monitoring how long you use your computer. Because apparently Windows is making statements about how many hours people are spending on Windows 10, because it's a more impressive number than how many people actually installed Windows 10 and have decided not to use it at all. But there is a privacy invasion factor. And if we had a government that we could trust not to mishandle private information, I don't think we'd be as upset. Because certainly there are some positive uses for this kind of surveillance. There are certain ads we just don't want to see at all. We're not interested in that line of product. And we do want to see ads for the things that we are interested in buying. That's a legitimate positive use of that kind of information. But because this government has such a track record of misusing the information it collects, I think that's why people are digging their heels in on the issue of privacy. Because it is one of those one of those rights recognized by the Constitution. We, the people, came into the creation of a new government with our rights intact. And all the Bill of Rights does, it's the promise by the government they will respect those rights. Clearly, they don't any longer. And that's why it's an illegal, illegitimate government. Now, we're getting another one of these firearm stories. This is out of Missouri, being reported on PatriotsRising.com. And it's a woman named Katie Claxton, and she lives in Springfield. And apparently Sunday night, she was approached by a man wielding a large knife. Fortunately, her husband was nearby, legally carrying, pointed the gun at the man and scared him off. Didn't have to pull the trigger, which is a good thing. I mean, when you talk about firearms for personal defense, doesn't mean you're going to pull the trigger. It's just the possibility that you might is a deterrent to crime. And you never see the corporate media reporting on these stories. But the reality is that every year an estimated 1.5 million crimes are thwarted in progress because the potential victim is carrying a legal weapon. The police don't thwart that many crimes. The police are never there when the crime actually happens. They show up after it's long over, pose with the dead bodies, promise retribution somewhere down the road, and try and act like they're relevant to what just happened. So, anyway. So there's another one. And I, too, when I lived in Southern California, I chased a burglar out of our home. Did not have to pull the trigger. Now, we're starting to see the propaganda come on out regarding what's going on in Oregon. So there's this story at RINF.com basically saying that there's a new government report that finds the number of anti-government militia groups is skyrocketing. So they're back to the domestic extremist booga booga, and they were doing that one in the 1990s as well. Now, I think, according to that Gallup poll, most Americans are now anti-government. And I think there's a legitimate reason for community militias in an age where the police are more of a problem than the criminals are. But, again, I do not encourage or suggest initiating violence against the government. I do suggest being prepared in case the government initiates violence against you. That seems to be prudent, all things going on. But always remember, if there is a militia somewhere nearby that you're thinking about joining, it is guaranteed it's being infiltrated by the FBI, if it hasn't been started by the FBI, to try and lure in all the potential troublemakers. So I remember again back in the 1990s, there was a big scandal where the communications director for the Tri-States militia turned out to be an FBI informant. The FBI loves to set these things up. And then they will go on out and they'll lead this militia group to do something really stupid that the media can use to demonize patriot militias. The FBI loves to play dirty. And if you don't believe me, go back and read the history of COINTELPRO. They are not the swell bunch of Joes that TV and movies make them out to be. They just aren't. TV and movies are co-opted to propagandize you that the government people are always good and anti-government people are always bad. If you are my age, you probably remember a movie called The FBI Story, starring Jimmy Stewart. And it's very interesting. Most people don't know this outside of Hollywood. J. Edgar Hoover was actually on the set of that film telling the director how to make the movie to produce the best possible public image for the FBI. Hoover actually appears in the film briefly in a cameo, but only from the backside. At that stage in the growth of the FBI, his identity wasn't being publicized, partly because they were concerned that those who knew about his particular sexual orientation were going to recognize him and be in a position to blackmail him, which apparently organized crime was able to do, because J. Edgar Hoover went to his grave insisting there was no such thing as organized crime, despite being head of the FBI. All righty. Now then, somebody just sent me a video that we put up where the corporate media is talking to some of the eyewitnesses to what happened in San Bernardino, who are all telling the same consistent story. 3 tall, white, athletic men in military gear were the shooters. And the corporate media describes these witnesses, well, they're obviously confused. They're obviously confused. They think they saw these 3 tall, white, athletic men when we all know it was the Farouk's little, scrawny, 90-pound woman, and the other guy. We know it was them. You will believe it was them. And anybody who saw anything, well, they're wacko conspiracy kook nutcases. But that's what the media does when you try and tell the truth. Oh, you're obviously confused. The problem has to be you. But as I was telling that caller earlier today, we don't need any more investigations into 9/11 or Saddam's nuclear weapons or the rest of it. We all agree on the basic problem. The government uses lies, fraud, and deception to control us, to take our money, to try and get our obedience, human-caused global warming being one of them. We don't need to study these anymore. We already know what the problem is. The question before the American people now is, are we going to continue living under a government that rules us with lies, fraud, and deception? And the time has come to start seriously thinking about that. We'll be back after these few words. Hello, hi America. Welcome back to our show, last segment of the program today. And I'm being sent a series of articles, which I'm posting to the main page of WhatReallyHappened.com, about how over the years, the Bureau of Land Management has itself set fires on various ground, ostensibly to control overburden, and these fires got out of control, and they burned homes, cattle, destroyed grazing land. The BLM never got charged with terrorism. And apparently there's a great deal of articles out there about how the Bureau of Land Management destroyed people's ranches with these fires. that got out of control, but they never got charged with terrorism. Seems to be a bit of a double standard going on out there. You know, Michael Crichton, in his book State of Fear, and if you haven't read it, you should, because he takes the whole global warming cult apart. And, of course, was attacked viciously in the media for writing the book. But Crichton had reached the age where he had all the money he wanted, and he was writing books to try and alert the public to some very dangerous social trends. And there were books like Airframe, State of Fear, and I'm trying to remember the last one that was about uncontrolled genetic engineering. But in State of Fear, there is a character who comes into the middle of the story and talks about Yellowstone National Park. And it turns out that this character and what he says was taken from a speech Michael Crichton wrote when he was asked to talk to some of these emerging environmental groups who are out there screaming, corporations are bad, corporations are evil, corporations are causing damage. And Crichton said, it's not always that clear cut. And he laid out the history of Yellowstone National Park and how throughout the years it has been repeatedly ruined by well-meaning environmentalists who came in and suggested a change without understanding the complexities of the system they were tampering with. And they started tinkering with it, and things got out of control. And Yellowstone today is nothing at all like what it was when it was first made a national park, other than the rocks and the geology. As far as the wildlife and the plant life, they've all changed several times because of some very disastrous decisions made by very well-intentioned people who just didn't understand what they were doing. And we see that kind of recklessness certainly within our government, certainly within the human cause global warming movement, which seems like a good segue into the topic. Apparently over in northern Sweden, actually in Lapland, the town in Nikkaluokta in Lapland set an all-time cold temperature record of minus 34.8 degrees centigrade. That is cold. Very cold. Now, we are getting warnings that the polar vortex is returning and should be over the U.S. in mid-January. Now, they're trying to use that phrase, polar vortex, like this is something that was unexpected, and we can't fault the global warming cult for not knowing about something that just came out of nowhere. But the reality is there are vortices over both polar regions. And yes, they do cycle cold air from the Arctic down to lower latitudes. It's always been there. But the carbon Nazis are understanding that even though winter was slow to start because of El Nino, it's still coming, and it's going to be a rough one, and they're trying to figure out some way they can save their human-caused global warming agenda and, more importantly, get the carbon taxes, even though we're going to have another rough winter. Now, good news for the people at Lake Tahoe, their drought has officially ended. They've got a huge snowpack built up already this winter that has taken them off drought status. Over in Spokane, Washington, a plane that was on its way to Denver skidded on the ice on the runway and wound up in a snowbank. Gosh darn that human-caused global warming and all the problems it causes. Now, over in New Jersey, ever since 9/11, there's this school that has a tradition of saying, God bless America, every morning. Which, fine. I don't have a problem with that, but apparently the ACLU did, and they got very upset that after the daily recital of the Pledge of Allegiance, saying God bless America, violated the principles of separation of church and state. Technically, yes, it does. I think it's such a trivial matter. Doesn't the ACLU have more important things to be looking at? I mean, I'm not a believer, and I don't have a problem when somebody says, God bless America. Okay, it's a nice thought. I appreciate the thought. Good. Apparently out in California, Nestle is continuing to drain the California aquifers and bottle the water for sale in California, even though they are under investigation for having been effectively stealing the water since their permit that they paid something like $500 for expired several years ago. And they're still going on and doing, and I'm sure they're writing very generous campaign contributions to California politicians for the elections end of this year. But it is rather amazing. Finally, a story that I think should be of concern to everybody, as we know that our government is desperate to start a major war on which they can blame what appears to be an imminent economic crash. Apparently, the National Guard from New Mexico is being deployed to the Middle East to fight terrorism. Now, the National Guard is supposed to be the state's army under the control of the state governor. That was changed following the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles, where the National Guard was federalized and taken away from control of the state's governor. If the state's governor needs the National Guard, he needs to clear it with Washington, D.C. now. That's not what the National Guard is for. It's not the sixth branch of the U.S. military. It's supposed to be the state armed forces. It's the governor's army to deal with problems. But they're being sent over to the Middle East, and I hope New Mexico doesn't have any problems, because remember when Hurricane Katrina hit and did all that damage in New Orleans, and one of the reasons it happened is because the Louisiana National Guard was over in Iraq, and they had taken all of the available sandbags for portable protection, so there weren't enough left to deal with the floods when the levees started collapsing. Washington, D.C. is spending everything in this nation on this war campaign. And when it's all over, and they've lost, there's going to be nothing left in this country with which to rebuild. It's one of the problems with the war hawks. They're very short-sighted. They can only see to the point of victory or defeat. They don't even want to see that. And they don't think about what's going to happen to people after the war. They really don't care. That's why we have problems with illegally buried nuclear waste, poisoning neighborhoods from Manhattan Project, why we have barrels of chemical weapons and unexploded munitions all over the ocean floor off of Oahu. Somebody says there's a war. It seems to be a license for complete reckless behavior by the government. Because it's war. War justifies everything. I disagree with that. And I think with this kind of reckless behavior, whether it's the radioactive landfill or unexploded munitions, it's basically a reminder that war doesn't just kill the present. It does murder part of the future. But that's apparently not a factor for the people who want war. There's the music. Time for me to get on out of here. I'll be back tomorrow here on the Genesis Communication Network. Please make a point of contacting your friends and family who are not necessarily plugged into the net or to independent media or Genesis Communication. Start introducing them. If Gallup is correct, Americans are asking a lot of questions. You, the Rivero's Rangers, must be there with the answers. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.